Montpelier, Vermont, in the spring of 1983, was the kind of place where nothing seemed to change too quickly. Brick sidewalks lined sleepy streets. Church bells echoed from the hilltops, and the scent of thawed earth mingled with maple on the breeze. It was a quiet town, perched comfortably in the folds of the Green Mountains, where even the smallest routines were noticed, and any deviation from them stirred attention. Every morning at precisely 8:30, Margaret Doyle left her home on Wilder Street for her daily walk. She wore the same navy windbreaker, laced her walking shoes with a double knot, and carried a cloth pouch filled with shelled peanuts for the squirrels along the eastern trail. She never missed a morning. At 72, Margaret was independent, sharp, and remarkably self-sufficient, a retired librarian. She had worked nearly 40 years at the Kellogg-Hubbard Library. She lived alone in the white clapboard house she once shared with her husband, Henry Doyle, who had died nearly 2 decades earlier in what officials at the time called a workplace accident. The loss had marked her deeply, but not visibly. She kept his books in order on their shelf. His armchair remained untouched, and every Sunday she polished the gold wedding band he had given her in 1938, its interior engraved with the initials M and H. Neighbors described Margaret as steady, private but kind. She had a soft voice, wore her silver hair in a low bun, and still read newspapers with a magnifying glass. And then, one morning in May, she was simply gone. It was a clear Thursday. Temperatures hovered in the mid-50s. A neighbor, Joan Walling, saw Margaret on her front steps around 8:20, tying her scarf. She waved, and Margaret waved back, but Joan would later say something felt different. Her expression was far away, like she wasn't really seeing me. Joan recalled, that was the last known sighting. By 11 a.m., concerned by the lack of movement around the house, Joan walked over and knocked on the door. There was no answer. The cloth pouch of peanuts sat untouched on the porch bench. By sunset, the police had been notified. What followed was an exhaustive 3-week search of Hubbard Park and the surrounding forested trails. Volunteer groups, Police K-9 units, and even a handful of Margaret's former students from the library days joined in. They combed paths, checked old stone bridges, and dragged shallow sections of the Winooski River. No sign of Margaret was found. No clothing, no identification, no footprints beyond the trail's main artery. Her home was just as she had left it. Kettle on the stove, slippers beside her reading chair, a loaf of bread half sliced in the kitchen. Her wallet was on the dining room table. Her wedding ring, however, was not. Investigators found no signs of struggle or forced entry. Nothing was missing. Nothing was disturbed. The theory most quietly favored by authorities was simple. An elderly woman, grieving quietly, had wandered off in the woods and died of exposure. But to those who had known her, that explanation didn't fit. Margaret had never once strayed from her routines. She hiked only well-maintained trails. She kept detailed notes on her pantry inventory. She wrote holiday cards in alphabetical order. The idea that she had simply lost her way or chosen to vanish out of confusion didn't align with anything they knew. And then there were the documents. While clearing her desk for official review, authorities found a folder labeled Town Records, Personal Copies. Inside were newspaper clippings, property log, and state safety reports, all tied to Henry Doyle's final inspection assignment before his death in 1965. Henry had worked for the Vermont Office of Infrastructure Review, primarily assessing dam safety and water treatment facilities. According to the official file, he'd been killed in a mechanical failure during a valve test at the Millbridge hydroelectric plant, but the reports Margaret had gathered included corrections, overlapping dates, and even a memo referencing unauthorized personnel on site. Most telling was a letter dated 2 months before Margaret vanished. It was unsigned but addressed to a now-retired local contractor named Bernard Kellum. The letter was cautious in tone and included one cryptic line. There are details about Henry's death that were buried, perhaps deliberately. I intend to understand why. Police noted the letter, but dismissed it as a possible manifestation of long-held grief. Still, whispers began to circulate in town that Margaret had been digging into old state records, that she'd gone up to Burlington to visit the public archives 3 separate times that spring, that she'd asked the library staff for books on investigative research techniques. To the public, the case was eventually labeled as a cold missing persons file. But for those closest to her, the story never sat right. Time passed. Her house was maintained by a distant cousin. The garden was left wild. The trail she walked each morning remained open but took on an uneasy stillness. By 1995, few still spoke of Margaret Doyle until one spring afternoon when the forest gave something back. It was a group of high school students from Rutland on a conservation excursion who made the discovery. While cataloging fallen trees near the edge of the forest, one student came across an old stump, dry, cracked, and partially hollow. Inside, nestled within a rotted knot in the wood, was a gold wedding band. Simple, thin, dull by time. Engraved with the initials M and H. The students notified their teacher. Rangers were called. The ring was removed carefully and sent for analysis. The inscription matched perfectly with Margaret Doyle's marriage certificate. The band showed signs of long exposure to moisture, soil, and decay, but had been placed intentionally, not dropped, not lost. When the tree stump was excavated, another discovery followed. Wrapped tightly in old wax paper and tucked beneath a cluster of roots was a set of folded pages, not typed, not printed, but written in Margaret Doyle's unmistakable cursive handwriting. They were fragments, but they told a story. The papers pulled from beneath the old stump were brittle, water-stained, and torn in places, but still legible in Margaret Doyle's unmistakable penmanship, elegant, upright, and methodically spaced, just as those who had borrowed books from her desk at the Kellogg-Hubbard Library remembered. There were 9 pages in total, folded in thirds, each wrapped inside layers of wax paper and secured with faded string. On the outermost sheet, written in the upper right corner, were the words, "If found, please read with care. I am not lost." That sentence alone challenged 12 years of speculation. The handwriting was consistent with examples from her personal correspondence. Linguists later confirmed the structure, and word choices were highly unlikely to have been forged. This was her voice. The content, however, was far from simple. Each page read like part diary, part confession, as though Margaret had written in secrecy, trying to create a map of thoughts without giving everything away. Much of it referred to Henry, her late husband, but not in a mournful way. These were not expressions of grief. They were notes of suspicion, curiosity, and, increasingly, quiet fear. One line, midway through page 3, stood out. "I used to believe in bad luck. Now I believe in bad men." Margaret described her slow realization that the details surrounding Henry's accident had never made sense to her. For years, she'd accepted the official explanation: a failed release valve, a miscommunication, a tragic workplace incident. But as she grew older and as fewer people remembered, she began to revisit the gaps. She referenced a state report that had been corrected after filing, a missing toolbox from the accident site, a photograph taken by a plant engineer that had vanished from public archives. She mentioned that Henry had told her, shortly before his death, that he had raised concerns about modified pressure levels in the dam system and that someone had told him to let it go. Then, near the end of the 5th page, came a single chilling statement. "If what he told me is true, they altered the readings before inspection. That's not error. That's cover." Margaret believed Henry had uncovered deliberate negligence, or possibly sabotage, and that his death was not the result of a simple malfunction, but something orchestrated. Whether or not her theory was correct, the tone of her writing changed dramatically after that. Her entries grew more fragmented, like someone writing in haste. She mentioned trips to Burlington, efforts to recover missing documents, and coded notations made in borrowed books, so no one would think they were mine. Then, I no longer know who to trust. The people who said they'd help have gone silent. And 2 weeks ago, someone knocked at my back door. No one was there. That detail rattled investigators. There had never been any reports of break-ins. No neighbors had reported strange activity, and nothing had been found in her home in 1983 to suggest surveillance or tampering. But Margaret's words hinted that she felt watched. Hunted, even. Still, she had chosen not to run in the traditional sense. Instead, she wrote, "If they want me gone, I will give them what they expect, but I will choose where and how. And then, the ring will stay, the words will stay. If no one finds me, then let the tree tell it someday." It was unclear when exactly she had written the notes. Based on references to spring conditions and the age of the stump, authorities believed she had buried them and the ring within days of her disappearance. The question that followed was natural and deeply unsettling. Did she walk into the forest intending to vanish? Or had she only hidden part of herself, a symbolic act, not a permanent one? Despite renewed searches in the area around the stump, no further traces of Margaret were found. No clothing, no bones, no path leading deeper into the woods. Cadaver dogs brought in from out of state found no conclusive evidence of human remains. But something else caught investigators' attention. Near the stump, hidden beneath dry pine needles and brush, they found a small metal clasp, the kind used to hold pages together inside a library binder. Not unusual in itself. But inside the clasp was a fragment of cardstock, weathered but visible. It bore the title of the book, Justice Deferred, Industrial Oversight and the Public Risk. It was a title not widely circulated. It had been published by a Vermont University press in the late 1960s and was considered academic, almost obscure. When cross-referenced with records from the Kellogg-Hubbard Library, it was found that only one copy had ever been checked out between 1980 and 1983. The borrower? Margaret Doyle. The date of return was never logged. It was as though she had taken the book, studied it quietly, and folded its knowledge into her own personal investigation, long before any of it came to light. The discovery of the stump, the ring, and the pages caused a stir in Montpelier. For the first time in over a decade, local papers reopened the story. People who had known Margaret came forward again. Some recalled odd things, the way she began carrying 2 different walking sticks in her final weeks, switching them day to day. One neighbor said she'd begun drawing symbols in chalk on her fence, always erasing them after a day or 2. Another said she had noticed Margaret writing in a small notebook, but always tearing out the page before walking inside. When asked about Margaret's state of mind in 1983, one former co-worker said, "She was alert, but distant, like someone playing chess in her mind while smiling at you in conversation." The Vermont State Police issued a formal update, reclassifying the case from missing person, presumed deceased, to unresolved disappearance, under review. But with no body and no indication of foul play, no further action was taken. Still, people began walking the trail again. They visited the stump, now marked with a discreet wooden sign at the base of the tree line, not as a memorial, but as a question. Why had she chosen that tree? Had she been there often? Had it been special? Or had it simply been the last quiet place left? The old stump at the edge of the trail, now known quietly by locals as Margaret's Tree, became more than a curiosity after the discovery of her wedding ring and handwritten pages. It became a marker, not just where she may have gone, but the deliberate way she seemed to vanish. In the weeks that followed the stump's excavation, a small team of researchers from the Vermont Historical Society was given access to Margaret Doyle's personal belongings, the few that had remained untouched in her Wilder Street home. The house had stood mostly preserved since her disappearance. A distant cousin had maintained it, but refused to sell. "It feels like she's still deciding whether to come back," he told a reporter from the Montpelier Times. Inside the home, the team found something unusual. Margaret's bookshelf, neat and alphabetized, was missing 3 volumes, all nonfiction titles from the local history section. But in their place were custom placeholders, handwritten cards, each with drawing in pencil, a triangle, a spiral, and a pine tree. At first, These seemed like bookmarks or personal reminders. But when researchers matched the drawings to the last pages Margaret had hidden in the stump, they noticed something strange. The same symbols had appeared faintly in the margins of her writing, just once each. Next, the passages that mentioned Henry, the Millbridge facility, and a cryptic line. Some roots grow sideways. Cryptography experts were consulted. The theory was this. Margaret had been encoding information within her notes, not in cipher language, but in location-based markers. Each symbol, they proposed, matched an area of the trail system behind her home. The triangle resembled the shape of the observation rock near the West Ridge. The spiral appeared nearly identical to an old ironwork pattern on a forgotten park gate. The pine tree, traced in 3 lines, matched a carving once etched into a trail sign that had since faded. Was she creating a map? A series of places where she had left something? Volunteers walked those trails again, this time with the symbols in hand. And after 3 days, just beyond the observation rock, tucked beneath a patch of ferns and moss, they found a weathered metal tin. Inside, more wax paper, protecting 3 more fragments of writing. These pages were different. The handwriting was still Margaret's, but more compressed, almost frantic. Words overlapped. Sentences broke off mid-thought. Yet within the mess, certain phrases stood out. They did it to control the story, not the facts. Even the coroner's report had edits. You don't edit death. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of being erased. And then, circled twice. Truth doesn't live on paper. It lives in doubt. The find confirmed what many already suspected. Margaret had been planting pieces. Not just a farewell, but a trail of thoughts, hidden in nature, maybe hoping one day someone would stitch them together. It also changed the tone of the investigation. This wasn't someone who wandered off in grief or confusion. This was someone executing a plan, alone, methodical, and without alerting a single person. But why? Why leave clues if not to be found? Why vanish without finishing the message? In her recovered writings, Margaret referenced Henry's final report, the one filed the day before his accident, as something she had seen but never been able to retrieve. She called it the last honest page. Yet when researchers scoured state archives, no such document could be located. There was no missing record officially acknowledged, no gap in the filing system, no misfiled entry. But one archivist, reviewing scanned microfilm from the late 1970s, discovered something peculiar. A logbook entry for the Millbridge hydroelectric plant dated April 15, 1965. 2 weeks before Henry's death had been overwritten. A page number was corrected, and the initials next to the correction weren't from any known supervisor. The handwriting style was neat, formal, and matched Margaret's. She had been there. At some point, she had entered the archive room herself, quietly, without permission, and made a mark. If true, it meant that long before her disappearance, Margaret had been investigating with more depth and perhaps more boldness than anyone realized. She hadn't just noticed inconsistencies. She had gone inside the system to trace them. This brought up a difficult possibility, that Margaret had drawn too much attention. In her writings, she never named names, but she did mention 2 voices on the phone during a call she received in April 1983. She wrote that one of the voices remained silent, breathing heavily, while the other simply said, "It's not worth it. Let him rest." She never wrote what she said in response, but she did write that she didn't feel safe afterward, that she had started carrying Henry's pocket knife in her coat, that she had begun mapping the trails behind her home, not for walks, but for exits. And yet, she didn't flee. She stayed. She watched. She wrote. And she waited. Her notes described not panic, but patience, the quiet certainty of someone preparing for a very specific ending. One passage, nearly illegible, read, "To vanish is to choose silence, but silence with intention, not surrender." This line became something of a motto for those who continued to follow her story. Historians, writers, even students of behavioral psychology began to reference Margaret Doyle not as a victim, but as an enigma, a woman whose life took on symbolic weight long after she disappeared. In 1996, a year after the Stump was found, a small exhibit was created at the local historical society. Margaret's Trail. It featured replicas of the pages, a photo of her wedding ring, and a section of the trail map annotated with her symbols. The original papers remained locked in preservation storage, fragile but untouched. Still, even then, questions lingered. If Margaret had planned everything, why leave so much unfinished? Was there more? And if so, where? In the quiet of the Kellogg-Hubbard Library's second-floor archives, where the floorboards creaked and the light filtered and muted through tall, arched windows, Margaret Doyle had spent decades organizing knowledge. She believed in order, in systems, in the quiet satisfaction of things properly stored. So when an assistant librarian in 1997 decided to reorganize the old municipal history section, it was pure coincidence that she pulled a slim, unmarked binder from between two bound issues of the Montpelier Evening Argus. The binder had no spine label, no checkout card, no classification sticker, but inside, pressed between old cataloging sheets and faded paper sleeves, were more pages in Margaret's handwriting. These weren't personal reflections or journal fragments. These were reference notes, dozens of them. Each page listed titles, dates, page numbers, and margins where Margaret had written summaries or questions in red pencil. Several entries had a pattern. They linked minor city planning decisions in the 1960s to sudden budget reallocations, followed by safety reviews, some approved, others canceled. Her notes always ended with a simple two-letter abbreviation, QM. Archivists, now accustomed to following Margaret's coded breadcrumbs, started cross-referencing again. They discovered that QM stood not for a name, but for a phrase Margaret had invented. In one of her Stump writings, the letters were spelled out once. Quiet manipulation. She had begun identifying decisions she believed were quietly redirected. Not blocked, not erased, but nudged. Infrastructure projects rerouted. Inspection timelines adjusted. Language in reports shifted from failure risk to performance variance. To most readers, those terms meant little. But to Margaret, they were warnings buried in bureaucracy, and her theory was growing clearer. That Henry Doyle hadn't just stumbled on an accident waiting to happen. He had stepped into a system designed to bury small truths before they became big ones. She was convinced he'd caught someone's pattern, and she believed that his death, whether directly caused or not, had served a purpose for someone. But still, the most haunting question remained. If she had discovered all this, why not go to the police? To the papers? Perhaps the answer came from one of the last pages in the unmarked binder. It read, "They control the version, not the fact. But the version is what gets remembered." That line echoed through the halls of the Historical Society, the newspaper office, even the police department. It wasn't just about Henry's death. It was about the fragility of truth itself. Margaret hadn't trusted official channels, so she used her own, and she kept building her map. In early 1998, a retired trail warden named Ed Haskins contacted a reporter after reading about the binder. He said that back in the spring of 1983, a few weeks before Margaret disappeared, he saw her standing alone near a side trail just beyond the cemetery loop. Not unusual in itself. But what struck him was what she was doing. She was measuring tree distances with a string, he said, kneeling down, placing rocks. I asked if she was mapping erosion, and she smiled and said, "Just marking what matters." Ed hadn't thought anything of it, but now, with context, it sounded deliberate. A new search was organized in the area he described, and once again, they found something. Near the base of a leaning birch tree, under a stone arranged precisely in a triangle with two others, they uncovered a small, rusted tin, the same kind used for index cards in a library. Inside were three objects: a fragment of map with coordinates handwritten in pencil, a photograph of Henry Doyle, taken in 1963, with a handwritten message on the back. He knew more than he said, and a small leather notebook, water damaged, but still readable. This notebook was different from the others. Its tone was colder, sharper, less emotional. Margaret was not reflecting in these pages. She was tracking. She wrote of watching former colleagues of Henry's, where they moved, who they worked for, what projects they consulted on after leaving state service. She wrote of irregular visits to city offices, of people checking files that hadn't been touched in years. Most disturbing was this line. He wasn't the only one they silenced. He was just the one who died in daylight. It was the first time Margaret implied, even indirectly, that others may have suffered similar fates. But again, no names, no accusations, just patterns, dots, quietly connected. Investigators now began to entertain a grim possibility, that Margaret hadn't simply fled for fear of reprisal, that she may have stayed too long, watched too closely, and begun to sense the same tightening noose that had surrounded her husband, that her disappearance, so carefully orchestrated, may have been not only an act of escape, but an act of survival, or defiance. Back in town, people speculated in whispers. Some believed she had gone deeper into the forest, leaving her clues in a widening arc. Others believed she had escaped the region entirely, perhaps by train, perhaps under an assumed name. But a third group believed something else, that she had never left the woods, that Margaret, meticulous and measured, had planned everything down to the last footprint. To them, the placement of the ring in the stump wasn't a sign of surrender. It was her final catalog entry, a way to say, this is where I end, but the story doesn't. In 1999, the Vermont Historical Society moved the stump, carefully extracted and preserved, into a glass display case in its museum wing. It stands surrounded by copies of her writings, photographs of the trail, and an interactive map of the symbols she used. People come from all over to see it. Children ask about the lady who vanished, and docents explain not just her mystery, but her method, because Margaret Doyle didn't just disappear. She archived herself. In the decades since Margaret Doyle's disappearance, her story stopped being just a mystery and became something deeper, a kind of folklore grounded in fact. In Montpelier, her name became shorthand for quiet resistance, for a mind that never stopped cataloging, even as the world stopped asking. By the early 2000s, the exhibit at the Vermont Historical Society had drawn national interest. Journalists, archivists, and true mystery enthusiasts visited to walk the trail she marked, read the fragments she left behind, and study the symbols she'd hidden like reference tags in the forest. But despite the renewed attention, no one ever found her, and perhaps that was the point. One final entry, found years later behind a false panel in the attic of her home, offered the closest thing to a farewell. It was a single sheet laminated, protected with care, and placed inside a hollowed-out book, Walden, by Henry David Thoreau. The note read, I do not fear being forgotten. I fear being misfiled. If I am gone, let it be because I chose the silence, not because someone wrote me into it. That page changed how even law enforcement described her case. The Vermont State Police officially classified it as a voluntary disappearance, purposeful concealment. The phrasing was rare, reserved for people whose vanishing could not be attributed to crime, accident, or mental illness, only intention. The last public statement from authorities came in 2003. All available evidence suggests that Margaret Doyle prepared for her disappearance with care and deliberation. While we do not know where she went, we believe she knew. But even after that declaration, small details continued to surface. In 2005, a ranger clearing brush near the Upper Ridge Path discovered a tree with faint markings, not initials, but numbers. 2 digits, 43.37. When matched recordings from Margaret's earlier map fragments, they pointed not to a location, but to a page number in a 1971 infrastructure audit she had once referenced. On that page, someone had circled a line in pencil. Records may be subject to discretionary amendment under departmental review. It was Margaret's handwriting. She had made her last argument not in court, not in conversation, but in the margins of forgotten report, filed, sealed, and left behind. And what began as a woman missing from a morning walk had evolved into something rare, a self-authored archive of suspicion, grief, and resilience. Her story changed how archivists handled government records. It sparked conferences on civilian oversight in public infrastructure. It inspired novels, college theses, even a stage play titled The Wind in Wilder Street. But no fiction ever matched the quiet power of what she actually did. She didn't run to the news. She didn't accuse anyone directly. She didn't shout. She observed. She wrote. And she vanished with precision. As for where she went, that remains the unanswered question. Some believe she left Vermont entirely, perhaps under a different name, supported by friends who understood the stakes. Others believe she built a shelter deeper in the woods, using her knowledge of terrain and natural concealment to live out her final years alone. A third theory, quieter, more symbolic, suggests she meant to become part of the forest itself, returning her thoughts to the earth and letting time sort the truth. Regardless of which is true, her legacy remains visible. The stump, the ring, the notes, the binder, the final page inside Walden. They've all become part of her index, not of where she went, but of who she was. A woman who refused to be misfiled. A librarian who treated her own disappearance like a final catalog entry. A widow who questioned everything and trusted no system to answer her. Today, visitors to the historical exhibit still linger by the glass case, holding her ring. They often pause longest not at the photos or the handwriting, but at a single typed line printed on the wall above the display. It's taken from the last sentence Margaret ever wrote. If they won't preserve what's true, then I will, and I'll leave it where someone eventually notices.